Have you ever been to a wedding where everything that could go wrong did go wrong, but somehow it led to the most beautiful love story you never saw coming? I'm talking about those moments when chaos turns into destiny, when what feels like a disaster becomes the beginning of everything you never knew you wanted. Because sometimes the most impossible situations create the most incredible connections. And today I'm going to tell you about Sophia Chun, whose simple act of kindness at a wedding changed two lives forever. It started with what should have been the perfect Saturday afternoon in Manhattan, the kind of crisp October day that made Central Park look like a painting and convinced everyone that fall weddings were pure magic. Sophia Chun stood in the bridal suite of the Plaza Hotel, carefully adjusting her best friend Claire's veil for the third time in 10 minutes, trying to calm the pre-ceremony jitters that had both of them on edge. At 28, Sophia had been maid of honor at more weddings than she cared to count, but this one felt different. Maybe it was because Claire had been her college roommate, the sister she'd chosen rather than the one she'd been born with. Maybe it was because watching her friend marry into old New York money made Sophia acutely aware of her own single status and her small studio apartment in Queens. Or maybe it was simply because something in the air felt electric, charged with possibility she couldn't quite name. The ceremony was being held in the hotel's oak room, transformed into an elegant chapel with white roses and trailing ivy, crystal chandeliers casting warm light over rows of perfectly dressed guests. Sophia had walked down the aisle ahead of Claire, her sage green dress flowing around her as she took her place at the altar, scanning the crowd of Manhattan's elite while the string quartet played softly in the background. That was when she first heard it, a thin, desperate wailing that cut through the elegant atmosphere like a knife through silk. Every head in the room turned toward the back corner where the sound originated, and Sophia felt her heart squeeze with sympathy as she spotted the source. A man sat alone in the last row, his broad shoulders tense beneath an expertly tailored black suit as he tried to quiet the infant in his arms. Even from the altar, Sophia could see his frustration and embarrassment as the baby's cries grew louder, more insistent. He was strikingly handsome in that sharp, dangerous way that made smart women lose their minds, with dark hair perfectly styled and olive skin that spoke of Mediterranean heritage. But right now he looked utterly defeated by a tiny human who couldn't weigh more than 15 pounds. The bride's entrance music began, and Claire appeared in the doorway looking radiant in her custom Vera Wang gown. But the baby's wailing intensified, as if the little one sensed she was stealing focus from what should have been a moment of pure joy. Sophia watched Claire's face tighten with stress, saw her grip her father's arm a little too hard as she started down the aisle to a soundtrack of crying that was drowning out the string quartet. This was supposed to be perfect. Claire had planned every detail for over a year, and now this beautiful moment was being ruined by circumstances beyond anyone's control. Sophia glanced at the officiant, who was clearly struggling with whether to pause the ceremony, then back at the man who was rising from his seat, obviously preparing to leave with the inconsolable infant. Something inside Sophia's chest clenched tight. She'd always been the type of person who couldn't walk past a crying child without wanting to help, the one her family called when they needed a babysitter, the friend who somehow always knew exactly how to comfort someone in distress. Her maternal instincts, which had been dormant for months while she focused on her career as a pediatric nurse, suddenly roared to life. Without thinking about protocol or propriety or the fact that she was supposed to stay in position during the bride's entrance, Sophia stepped away from her place at the altar. She moved quietly but purposefully toward the back of the room, her heart hammering as she approached the stranger who was clearly preparing to make a hasty exit. The man looked up as she approached, and Sophia felt something electric shoot through her entire nervous system. His eyes were the most extraordinary shade of green she'd ever seen, like sea glass with flecks of gold, but right now they were dark with frustration and what looked like genuine despair. This wasn't just embarrassment about disrupting a wedding. This was a man at the absolute end of his rope. "Excuse me," Sophia whispered, reaching them just as he was shifting the baby to leave. "I'm a pediatric nurse. May I try something?" His eyebrows shot up in surprise, those remarkable eyes scanning her face with an intensity that made her feel suddenly self-conscious about approaching a complete stranger. For a moment, she thought he might refuse, might brush past her and disappear with his crying daughter. But then the baby's wails reached a new pitch of misery, and something in his expression crumbled. "Please," he said simply, his voice carrying a slight accent that made her think of expensive wine and warm Mediterranean nights. "Her name is Isabella. She's been like this for an hour." Sophia held out her arms, and after a moment's hesitation, he transferred the tiny bundle to her. Isabella was perhaps 4 months old, red-faced and furious, her little fists waving as she expressed her displeasure with the world. Sophia cradled her close, immediately beginning the gentle swaying motion that was pure instinct for her, the rhythm she perfected during countless shifts in the pediatric ward. "Hey there, beautiful girl," she murmured, her voice barely audible even to the man standing beside her. I know. Everything's too loud and bright and scary, isn't it? But you're safe now." She adjusted Isabella's position slightly, supporting her head while applying gentle pressure to her back, then began humming softly, a wordless melody that seemed to come from somewhere deep in her chest. It was something her grandmother had hummed to her as a child, passed down through generations of women who understood that sometimes love was expressed through sound rather than words. Gradually, incredibly, Isabella's crying began to subside. The angry wails became hiccuping sobs, then settled into the occasional whimper as her tiny body relaxed against Sophia's chest. The change was so dramatic that the man beside her actually took a step back in amazement. "How did you?" he began, then stopped, staring at his daughter who was now quiet except for the soft snuffling sounds of a baby who'd cried herself to exhaustion. Sophia looked up at him, struck again by how devastatingly handsome he was up close, and by something else she couldn't quite identify. There was power in the way he carried himself, authority in the set of his shoulders that spoke of a man accustomed to being in control. But there was also something lonely about him, something that made her want to smooth the worry lines from his forehead. "Babies can sense energy," she explained softly, still swaying gently with Isabella. "She was probably picking up on your stress about the crying, which made her cry more, which made you more stressed. It becomes a cycle. Sometimes they just need someone calm to reset their nervous system." Claire's processional was ending, and Sophia realized she needed to return to her position immediately. But as she prepared to hand Isabella back to her father, the baby's eyes fluttered open, revealing the same extraordinary green as the man's. Isabella looked up at Sophia with that serious, studying expression that babies get when they're trying to understand something important, and Sophia felt her heart do something complicated in her chest. "You're a natural," the man said quietly, his voice carrying a note of wonder that made something warm unfurl in Sophia's stomach. She hasn't stopped crying for anyone else. Not since her mother died. The simple statement hit Sophia like a physical blow. This beautiful little girl had lost her mother. This man was raising his daughter alone, probably dealing with grief and exhaustion and the overwhelming responsibility of caring for an infant without help. No wonder Isabella had been inconsolable. No wonder he looked like he hadn't slept in months. "I'm so sorry," Sophia whispered, meaning it completely. "She's beautiful. You're doing an amazing job." Their eyes met over Isabella's head, and for a moment the wedding, the guests, the entire world seemed to fade into background noise. Sophia felt as though she was falling into those green depths, as though something fundamental was shifting in her chest. This was dangerous territory, she realized dimly. This was the kind of attraction that made sensible women do foolish things. "I should get back," she said reluctantly, though everything in her wanted to stay in this quiet bubble with this mysterious man and his precious daughter. "Of course. Thank you. I mean that. You saved the entire wedding." As Sophia carefully transferred Isabella back to her father's arms, their fingers brushed for just a moment. The contact was brief, innocent, but it sent electricity racing up her arm and made her breath catch in her throat. She told herself it was just the emotion of the moment, the natural high that came from helping someone in need. But deep down, she knew it was something more dangerous than that. The rest of the ceremony passed in a blur of vows and rings and the traditional kiss that sealed Claire's happiness forever. But Sophia found herself stealing glances toward the back of the room, where Isabella remained peacefully quiet in her father's arms. Every time she looked, she found him watching her, those green eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her skin feel warm beneath her sage dress. During the recession, As guests moved from the ceremony space to the grand ballroom for cocktails, Sophia tried to focus on her maid of honor duties. She helped Claire with her dress, posed for countless photos, and made sure the bridal party stayed organized. But part of her attention remained tuned to the crowd, looking for glimpses of dark hair and broad shoulders, listening for Isabella's distinctive little sounds. She found them during the cocktail hour, in a quieter corner of the ballroom where fewer people were gathered. Isabella was awake and alert, studying the chandeliers with that serious baby concentration, while her father held her with the practiced ease of someone who'd been doing this alone for months. He'd found a seat that gave him a clear view of the room, Sophia noticed, positioning himself where he could see everyone and everything around him. It was a detail that struck her as oddly tactical, though she couldn't have said why. When he saw her approaching, something shifted in his expression, the careful mask he'd been wearing for the other guests falling away to reveal genuine warmth. Isabella immediately perked up when she spotted Sophia, making happy gurgling sounds and reaching out with her tiny hands. "I think she remembers you," he said, standing as Sophia reached them. The movement was fluid, graceful in a way that suggested either dance training or something more dangerous. "I'm Dante Romano, by the way, and you've met Isabella." "Sophia-chun," she replied, accepting his extended hand. The contact was firm, warm, and lasted just a moment longer than strictly necessary. "I work at Mount Sinai, in pediatrics." "That explains the magic touch," Dante said, and his smile transformed his entire face, making him even more devastatingly attractive than before. "I was starting to think my daughter just hated me." "Babies don't hate their parents," Sophia assured him, "but they do absorb stress and emotion. Being a single parent, especially with an infant, has to be incredibly overwhelming." Something flickered in his eyes at her words, a shadow that suggested there was more to his story than simple widowhood. But before she could analyze it further, Isabella began fussing again, and without thinking, Sophia reached out to stroke the baby's cheek with one finger. The effect was immediate and magical. Isabella quieted, her little hand wrapping around Sophia's finger with surprising strength, and those serious green eyes fixed on Sophia's face with what could only be described as recognition. "How do you do that?" Dante asked, his voice carrying a note of amazement and something else she couldn't identify, something that sounded almost like longing. "I don't know," Sophia admitted honestly. "I've always been good with kids. It's just intuitive, I suppose." The band was beginning to play, signaling that dinner was about to be served, and Sophia knew she needed to find her place at the bridal party table. But something about this moment felt too precious to break, too fragile and perfect to interrupt with the demands of wedding obligations. "I should find my table," she said reluctantly. "But it was wonderful meeting you both." "Wait," Dante said quickly, and there was urgency in his voice that made her pause. Could I possibly ask you something? It might sound crazy, but Isabella clearly responds to you in a way she doesn't with anyone else. My regular babysitter just quit, very suddenly, and I'm desperate. Would you consider helping me out, just temporarily? I'd pay you well, whatever you're making at the hospital." The offer hung in the air between them, loaded with possibilities she wasn't sure she was ready to explore. Taking care of his daughter would mean entering his world, whatever that world was. It would mean regular contact with this man who made her pulse race and her common sense take a vacation. It would mean getting attached to a baby who'd already managed to capture her heart in the span of 30 minutes. But it would also mean helping a family that clearly needed her, using her skills to make a difference in their lives. And if she was being completely honest with herself, it would mean more time with Dante, more opportunities to figure out what it was about him that made her feel like she was standing on the edge of a cliff, equally terrified and exhilarated by the prospect of jumping. She began, then stopped as Claire appeared at her elbow, slightly out of breath from posing for photos. "Soph, there you are. We need you for the family pictures before dinner starts." Her friend paused, taking in the domestic scene before her with raised eyebrows. "Oh, hi there. I didn't realize you knew any of our guests. Claire, meet Dante Romano and Isabella," Sophia said, making quick introductions while her mind raced with the implications of his offer. "Dante, this is Claire, the bride." "Congratulations," Dante said with the kind of polished charm that suggested he was comfortable in high society circles. "Your wedding is beautiful." And thank you for having us. Pictures, Claire reminded gently but firmly, tugging on Sophia's arm. The photographer is getting impatient. As they walked away, Sophia glanced back over her shoulder to find Dante watching her go, Isabella still cradled in his arms. The baby was tracking her movement too, those little green eyes fixed on Sophia with what looked like accusation, as though she was betraying their newfound bond by leaving. During dinner, while she sat at the head table and made appropriate conversation with the other bridesmaids, Sophia found herself replaying every moment of her encounter with Dante and Isabella. There had been something almost desperate in his offer, she realized. This wasn't just about convenient childcare. This was about a man at the end of his rope, clinging to the first person who'd been able to help his daughter. And there had been something else, too. Something in the way he'd looked at her that had nothing to do with her abilities as a caregiver and everything to do with the electric current that seemed to arc between them whenever their eyes met. Something that promised this arrangement, if she accepted it, would be far more complicated than simple babysitting. By the time the toasts began, Sophia had made her decision. It was risky, potentially foolish, and definitely outside her comfort zone. But when she looked across the ballroom and saw Dante gently bouncing Isabella while she dozed against his shoulder, when she saw the tender way he protected her from the noise and chaos around them, she knew she couldn't walk away. After her own toast to Claire, after the cake cutting and the first dances, and all the rituals that marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another, Sophia made her way back to where Dante was sitting. Isabella was awake again, making those soft baby sounds that indicated she was getting hungry and cranky. But when she saw Sophia approaching, her little face lit up with unmistakable joy. "About your offer," Sophia said quietly, settling into the chair beside them. "I'd like to accept. Temporarily. We can work out the details later, but Isabella needs consistency, and you need help." The relief that washed over Dante's face was so profound it made her chest tight. For just a moment, his carefully maintained composure cracked completely, and she caught a glimpse of the exhausted, overwhelmed man beneath the polished exterior. "Thank you," he said simply, but those two words carried the weight of absolute gratitude. "You have no idea what this means to me." To us. As the evening wound down and guests began to drift toward the exits, Sophia gathered her things and prepared to leave. Tomorrow was Sunday, and she'd planned to spend it doing laundry and meal prep for the week ahead. But now she found herself agreeing to meet Dante and Isabella at his apartment Monday morning to discuss the arrangement in detail. When she hugged Claire goodbye, her friend pulled her aside with a knowing look. "That man is gorgeous," she whispered, glancing toward where Dante was collecting Isabella's baby carrier and diaper bag. "But be careful, sophomore. There's something about him that screams dangerous territory." Sophia followed her friend's gaze, taking in the way other men at the wedding seemed to defer to Dante slightly, the way his movements had a predatory grace that suggested he was comfortable with violence. Claire was right to warn her. Everything about this situation was dangerous territory. But as Isabella caught sight of her and immediately reached out with grabbing hands, making those happy baby sounds that indicated she wanted to be held, Sophia felt her heart make the decision her brain was still trying to rationalize. Sometimes dangerous territory was exactly where you needed to go to find what you'd been missing your whole life. The reception was in full swing when Sophia finally allowed herself to relax into her role as maid of honor, moving through the elegant ballroom with practiced ease as she ensured everything ran smoothly for Claire's perfect day. The grand ballroom at the plaza had been transformed into something from a fairy tale, with cascading white orchids and crystal accents that caught the light from the massive chandeliers overhead. But even as she coordinated with the wedding planner and made sure the elderly relatives had comfortable seating, Sophia found herself hyper-aware of Dante's presence across the room. He'd found a table near the back, she noticed, positioned where he had clear sightlines to all the exits while keeping Isabella comfortable in her carrier beside his chair. There was something almost tactical about his choice of seating, though Sophia couldn't have explained why that observation made her pulse quicken. She told herself it was simply good parenting, a single father being cautious in a room full of strangers. But every time she glanced his way, she caught him watching the crowd with an alertness that seemed to go far beyond normal social awareness. During the father-daughter dance, while Claire swayed with her emotional father to their chosen song, Sophia felt eyes on her and turned to find Dante's gaze fixed on her with an intensity that made her skin warm beneath her sage dress. Isabella was dozing peacefully in his arms, her tiny fist curled against his black jacket, but his attention was entirely focused on Sophia. When their eyes met across the crowded dance floor, he offered a small smile that transformed his stern features completely, and Sophia felt that dangerous flutter in her chest that warned her she was already in deeper water than she'd intended. The evening progressed with all the expected rituals of an upscale Manhattan wedding. Sophia gave her rehearsed toast about friendship and forever love, helped Claire change into her reception dress, and posed for countless photos with the wedding party. But underneath the familiar routine, she was acutely aware of the decision hanging between her and the mysterious man who'd somehow managed to capture her attention so completely. When the formal activities finally wound down and guests began settling in for the dancing portion of the evening, Sophia seized her opportunity. She'd fulfilled her primary duties as maid of honor, and Claire was blissfully occupied with her new husband and their endless stream of well-wishers. This was the perfect time to have a real conversation with Dante, to figure out exactly what she might be getting herself into. She found him standing near the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked Central Park, Isabella alert and content in his arms as they watched the lights of the city beginning to twinkle in the growing dusk. Up close, away from the crowd and the formal ceremony, Dante looked somehow more human but also more dangerous. His black suit was clearly expensive, tailored perfectly to his broad shoulders and lean frame, but there was something in his posture that suggested he was more comfortable giving orders than taking them. "I wanted to thank you again," he said as she approached, his voice carrying that slight accent that made her think of warm Mediterranean nights. "Isabella has been fussy all week, and today was particularly difficult. You have a gift." Sophia felt her cheeks warm at the genuine gratitude in his tone. "I'm glad I could help. She's such a beautiful baby." "How old is she?" 4.5 months, Dante replied, his expression softening as he looked down at his daughter. "Her mother died when she was 6 weeks old. Complications from the delivery that the doctors couldn't prevent." The stark simplicity of his statement hit Sophia like a physical blow. This man had lost his wife when Isabella was barely more than a newborn, had been raising his daughter alone while dealing with his own grief and the overwhelming demands of caring for an infant. No wonder he looked exhausted beneath his polished exterior. No wonder Isabella had been so difficult to comfort. "I can't imagine how hard that must have been," Sophia said softly, meaning every word. "Being a single parent is challenging under the best circumstances, but losing your partner so soon after having a baby." She trailed off, not wanting to intrude on what had to be incredibly painful memories. "It's been difficult," Dante admitted, his voice carrying a weight that suggested he rarely allowed himself to acknowledge just how difficult. "My mother helps when she can, but she's getting older, and Isabella can be very particular about who she'll accept comfort from. Until today, I thought she just didn't like anyone except me." The vulnerability in his admission made something squeeze tight in Sophia's chest. This powerful, clearly successful man was struggling with one of the most basic aspects of parenthood, the simple ability to soothe his own child when she was upset. The isolation that must come with that, the constant stress of knowing you were the only person who could provide comfort, had to be overwhelming. "About your offer earlier," Sophia began, then paused as Isabella began making soft, cooing sounds, her little hands reaching towards Sophia with unmistakable intent. Without thinking, Sophia stepped closer, allowing the baby to grab onto her finger with that surprisingly strong grip that never failed to amaze her. "Please, consider it seriously," Dante said, his voice carrying an urgency that made her look up from Isabella to meet his intense green eyes. "My regular nanny, Mrs. Patterson, quit very suddenly last week. She'd been with us since Isabella was born, and I thought we had a stable arrangement. But she left without much notice, and the agency hasn't been able to find a suitable replacement." There was something in his tone that suggested there was more to the story than a simple employment change, but before Sophia could analyze it further, he continued speaking. "I know it's presumptuous to ask, given that we've just met, but Isabella's response to you is unlike anything I've seen. She's been difficult to settle lately, crying for hours despite having everything she needs." The pediatrician says there's nothing wrong with her physically, but she seems to sense stress in a way that makes everything harder. Sophia could hear the exhaustion beneath his controlled tone, could see the way his shoulders carried tension that probably never fully released. "How have you been managing work?" she asked, genuinely curious about how a single father balanced career demands with the needs of a fussy infant. "I work mostly from home now," Dante replied, and something flickered in his expression that made her think there was more complexity to his work situation than he was revealing. "But there are meetings I can't avoid, obligations that require my physical presence. This week I've had to cancel 3 important appointments because I couldn't leave Isabella with anyone she'd accept." The frustration in his voice was carefully controlled, but Sophia could hear it nonetheless. This was a man accustomed to being in control, to having his professional life run smoothly, and the unpredictability of caring for a difficult infant was clearly testing his limits. "I need to be honest with you," Sophia said, studying his face as she spoke. "I'm attracted to the idea of helping you both, but I also need to be practical. I have a full-time position at Mount Sinai that I love, and I'm helping support my younger sister through college. I can't just abandon my responsibilities for temporary childcare work." Something shifted in Dante's expression at her words, a flash of what might have been respect mixing with the desperation she'd glimpsed earlier. "Name your price," he said simply. "Whatever you're making at the hospital, I'll double it. This is temporary, just until I can find a permanent solution that works for Isabella." The offer was generous beyond anything Sophia had expected, generous enough to make her wonder exactly what kind of work Dante did that allowed him to make such financial promises without even blinking. Double her hospital salary would be enough to pay off her student loans early, to contribute significantly more to her sister Lily's education fund, to finally build the kind of financial security she'd been working toward for years. But it would also mean entering a world she didn't understand, working for a man who clearly had secrets beneath his polished exterior. There was something about Dante that set off warning bells in the back of her mind, some indefinable sense that his life was more complicated and potentially dangerous than he was revealing. "Now, this is where I have to ask you something, and I want you to really think about your answer. How many of you watching this have ever been offered help by someone you barely knew? Someone who seemed almost too good to be true? Did you take the risk, or did you walk away? Because sometimes life puts these impossible choices in front of us, these moments where we have to decide between safety and possibility, between the life we know and the one we might discover. And Sophia was standing right at one of those crossroads, holding a baby who'd already captured her heart and looking into eyes that promised complications she couldn't even imagine. Before Sophia could formulate a response to Dante's generous offer, his phone buzzed against the table where he'd placed it. She watched his expression change completely as he glanced at the screen, the careful charm and vulnerability disappearing behind a mask of cold authority that made her take an involuntary step backward. "Excuse me for just a moment," he said, his voice suddenly carrying an edge that hadn't been there seconds before. He answered the call with a curt greeting in what sounded like Italian, his free hand automatically adjusting Isabella's position as he spoke in rapid, harsh syllables that bore no resemblance to the warm, slightly accented English she'd been hearing all evening. Sophia didn't speak Italian, but she didn't need to understand the words to recognize the tone. This was a man giving orders, handling some kind of crisis with the kind of authority that suggested he was accustomed to having his commands followed without question. His entire posture had shifted, becoming more predatory, more dangerous, and she found herself wondering who exactly she was dealing with. The call lasted less than 2 minutes, but when Dante ended it and turned back to her, Sophia could see him struggling to return to the charming, grateful father persona he'd been projecting. There was tension in his jaw now, a hardness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. "I apologize," he said, but his voice still carried traces of the cold authority she'd just witnessed. "Work crisis. Unfortunately, it can't wait." "What kind of work do you do?" Sophia asked, the question out of her mouth before she could stop herself. Something about his reaction to that phone call had triggered every instinct she'd developed working in a hospital, where reading people's stress levels and potential for violence was sometimes a matter of safety. Dante studied her face for a long moment, as though weighing how much truth he could afford to reveal. "Import and export," he said finally. family business. Sometimes there are urgent situations that require immediate attention. It wasn't technically a lie, Sophia realized, but it wasn't the whole truth either. There had been something in his voice during that phone call, something that suggested his business dealings operated in worlds far removed from normal corporate concerns. I should get Isabella home, Dante continued, his attention already shifting toward logistics as he gathered the baby's carrier and diaper bag with practiced efficiency. But I meant what I said about the position. If you're interested, we could meet tomorrow to discuss the details. I live on the Upper East Side. You could see where you'd be working, meet Isabella again when she's well rested. The offer hung between them, loaded with possibilities that both excited and terrified her. Sophia looked down at Isabella, who was watching her with those serious green eyes that were so like her father's, and felt her heart make a decision her brain was still trying to rationalize. Tomorrow is Sunday, she said slowly. I could meet you in the afternoon, if that works. Just to discuss the arrangement and see how Isabella responds when she's not overstimulated by a wedding reception. Relief flooded Dante's features, so profound that Sophia wondered just how desperate his situation really was. 3 o'clock? He suggested, pulling out his phone to share his contact information. I'll send you the address. And Sophia, he paused, meeting her eyes with an intensity that made her breath catch. Thank you. You have no idea what this means to me. As they exchanged phone numbers and made arrangements for the following day, Sophia tried to ignore the way her pulse quickened every time his fingers brushed hers. This was supposed to be a practical discussion about temporary childcare, but there was nothing practical about the way her body responded to his proximity or the way Isabella seemed to light up whenever Sophia was near. When Dante finally left the reception, Isabella secure in her carrier while he navigated through the crowd toward the exit, Sophia found herself watching him go with a mixture of anticipation and apprehension. Near the hotel's entrance, she noticed him pause to speak briefly with a man who'd been sitting alone at one of the back tables throughout the reception. The conversation was quick, professional, but something about the other man's deferential body language made Sophia's earlier suspicions resurface. The man was clearly younger than Dante, built like someone who spent significant time in the gym, and when he moved to follow Dante toward the exit, Sophia caught a glimpse of something beneath his jacket that made her blood run cold. It might have been her imagination, might have been a trick of the light and her own paranoia, but for just a moment, she could have sworn she saw the outline of a shoulder holster. By the time she'd fully processed what she thought she'd seen, both men had disappeared into the Manhattan evening, leaving her standing in the plaza's elegant lobby with her heart racing and her mind spinning with questions she wasn't sure she wanted answered. But when her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number, containing nothing but an address on East 79th Street and a simple message that read, "Thank you again. See you tomorrow. D." Sophia found herself saving the contact information and already planning what she'd wear to visit a man whose world was clearly far more complicated than anything she'd ever encountered. She was walking into dangerous territory, and part of her knew it. But another part, the part that had felt something shift in her chest when Isabella had grabbed her finger with such trust, the part that had recognized something lonely and desperate in Dante's carefully controlled exterior, was already committed to seeing where this impossible situation might lead. Sunday afternoon arrived with the kind of crisp October clarity that made Manhattan look like a postcard, and Sophia found herself standing in front of an imposing limestone building on East 79th Street, staring up at windows that probably offered views most people could only dream of. The address Dante had given her was in one of the city's most exclusive neighborhoods, where doormen wore white gloves, and the closest thing to affordable housing was a studio apartment that cost more per month than most people made in a year. She'd chosen her outfit carefully that morning, settling on dark jeans and a soft cream sweater that looked professional without being too formal, paired with comfortable flats that would allow her to move easily while caring for Isabella. But standing in front of this building with its elegant facade and obvious wealth, Sophia felt underdressed and out of place, like a pediatric nurse from Queens pretending she belonged in a world of Manhattan elite. The doorman, a distinguished gentleman with silver hair and kind eyes, greeted her warmly when she approached the marble-clad entrance. "Miss Chun," he said with a slight smile. "Mr. Romano is expecting you. I'm James. I'll be seeing you regularly if you decide to work here." so please don't hesitate to ask if you need anything. The casual assumption that she'd already accepted the position made Sophia's stomach flutter with nerves. Was she that transparent, or was this simply how Dante's world operated, with the confidence that money could solve any problem and secure any outcome he desired? The elevator that carried her to the penthouse was the kind of smooth, silent ride that spoke of expensive engineering and meticulous maintenance. When the doors opened directly into Dante's foyer, Sophia felt her breath catch in her throat at the sheer scale and elegance of the space before her. The penthouse was spectacular in a way that made her small studio apartment feel like a closet by comparison. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered panoramic views of Central Park and the Manhattan skyline, while the interior was decorated with the kind of understated luxury that whispered rather than shouted its expense. Everything from the marble floors to the custom furniture spoke of money that had been invested thoughtfully, creating a space that was both impressive and somehow warm. Sophia, Dante's voice carried from somewhere deeper in the apartment, and she turned toward the sound to find him approaching with Isabella in his arms. The baby was dressed in a tiny pink outfit that probably cost more than Sophia's entire wardrobe, but her face lit up with unmistakable joy when she spotted Sophia across the spacious living area. "Welcome to our home," Dante said, and something in his voice suggested he was genuinely nervous about her reaction to his obvious wealth. "I hope the address wasn't too difficult to find." "Not at all," Sophia replied, though she was still processing the sheer magnitude of the space around her. "This is beautiful. The views are incredible." But even as she admired the sophisticated decor and breathtaking vistas, Sophia was calculating what this level of luxury must cost. The penthouse alone had to be worth tens of millions of dollars, and that was before considering the art on the walls, the custom furniture, the obvious attention to every detail. What kind of import-export business generated this level of wealth, especially for someone who appeared to be in his mid-30s? Isabella was reaching for her now, making those soft baby sounds that indicated she remembered their connection from the previous evening. When Sophia took her from Dante's arms, the infant immediately settled against her chest with a contented sigh that made both adults smile. "She slept better last night than she has in weeks," Dante said, his voice carrying a note of wonder. "I don't know what you did, but whatever it was, it worked. She was calm from the moment we got home until this morning." "Babies respond to energy," Sophia explained, automatically beginning the gentle swaying motion that seemed to be instinctive whenever she held an infant. "If you were relaxed because you knew someone could help her, she would have picked up on that and been able to settle more easily." Before Dante could respond, an older woman appeared from what Sophia assumed was the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel as she approached with a warm smile. The woman was perhaps in her late 60s, with silver hair pulled back in an elegant chignon and the kind of comfortable confidence that suggested she'd been running this household for years. "This must be Sophia," the woman said, her voice carrying a slight Italian accent that was more pronounced than Dante's. "I'm Maria Benedetti. I've been taking care of this family since before Isabella was born." There was something in Maria's tone, some subtle emphasis on the word family, that made Sophia look more closely at the older woman's expression. Maria's eyes were kind but shrewd, and when they met Sophia's gaze, there was a moment of assessment that felt like being measured against some invisible standard. "Maria has been invaluable," Dante said, his affection for the housekeeper evident in his voice. "She's the only reason I've managed to keep any semblance of order since Francesca died." The casual mention of his late wife's name sent a pang of something through Sophia's chest, though she couldn't have said whether it was sympathy for his loss or something more complicated. There was pain in his voice when he spoke of her, but also a kind of resigned acceptance that suggested he'd learned to carry his grief without letting it consume him. "Come," Maria said, gesturing for them to follow her toward the kitchen. "Let me show you where everything is for Isabella. Mr. Romano has had to handle so much on his own, but babies need consistency, especially when they've lost their mothers so young." The kitchen was a chef's dream, all professional-grade appliances and marble countertops, with a breakfast nook that offered views of the park below. Maria moved through the space with the efficiency of someone who knew every cabinet and drawer by heart, showing Sophia where the baby supplies were stored, explaining Isabella's feeding schedule and nap routine, demonstrating how the expensive bottle warmer and sterilizer functioned. But as Maria talked, Sophia noticed the way the older woman's eyes kept drifting toward Dante, who had settled at the breakfast bar with his phone, handling what appeared to be work calls with the same cold authority she'd witnessed at the wedding. There was concern in Maria's expression, mixed with something that looked almost like warning. "Mr. Romano works very hard," Maria said quietly, her voice pitched so that it wouldn't carry to where Dante was sitting. "Sometimes too hard. His business, it requires much of his attention, and not all of it is. How do you say straightforward?" The careful way she chose her words sent a chill down Sophia's spine. This was clearly a warning, delivered with the kind of diplomatic language that suggested Maria had significant practice in discussing dangerous topics without saying anything explicitly incriminating. "What kind of business is he in exactly?" Sophia asked, keeping her voice equally quiet while she adjusted Isabella's position in her arms. Maria's expression became carefully neutral. "Import and export, as he told you. But in certain industries, there are complications that require special attention. Mr. Romano, he is a good man, but his world is not simple. You should understand this before you commit to working here." Before Sophia could ask for clarification, Dante ended his call and approached them, his expression shifting back to the charming, grateful father persona she'd seen at the wedding. But now that Maria had pointed it out, Sophia could see the careful control underneath, the way he monitored his environment and everyone in it with an alertness that spoke of constant vigilance. "I hope Maria hasn't been overwhelming you with too many details," he said, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "Isabella's routine is fairly straightforward, though she can be particular about how things are done." As if summoned by the sound of her name, Isabella began making soft, fussing sounds, her little face scrunching up in preparation for what Sophia recognized as the beginning of a crying episode. Without thinking, she shifted the baby to her shoulder and began the gentle bouncing motion that had worked so well the night before, humming softly under her breath. The effect was immediate and magical. Isabella's distress signals faded into contented sighs, her tiny fist curling against Sophia's sweater as she settled into the rhythm of movement and sound. When Sophia looked up, she found both Dante and Maria watching her with expressions of amazement. "How do you do that?" Dante asked, his voice carrying the same wonder she'd heard at the wedding. "I've tried everything, every technique the pediatrician suggested, every piece of advice from parenting books, but nothing works like whatever you're doing. I think she just needs to feel safe," Sophia said simply, though she was beginning to suspect there was more to Isabella's crying than simple infant fussiness. Babies who lose their mothers early sometimes develop heightened sensitivity to stress and change. She's probably been picking up on your anxiety about caring for her alone, which creates a cycle where everyone gets more upset. The insight seemed to hit Dante like a physical blow. For just a moment, his carefully maintained composure cracked completely, revealing the exhausted, overwhelmed man beneath the polished exterior. He'd been carrying the weight of single parenthood, complicated by grief and what Maria's warning suggested was significant professional stress, and it was clearly taking a toll on both him and his daughter. Over the next hour, Sophia settled into the routine of caring for Isabella while Dante retreated to his home office to handle business calls. The office was positioned where he could see into the main living areas, she noticed, allowing him to monitor his daughter and her new caregiver while managing whatever crises required his attention. From her position in the living room, Sophia could hear fragments of his conversations, most conducted in rapid Italian with occasional switches to heavily accented English. The tone was consistently authoritative, sometimes harsh, and always carried the expectation that his instructions would be followed without question. This was clearly a man accustomed to command, to having his decisions respected and implemented immediately. But when he emerged from the office mid-afternoon, his demeanor shifted completely as he focused on his daughter. He moved with gentle confidence as he helped prepare Isabella's bottle, his large hands surprisingly delicate as he tested the temperature and adjusted her position for feeding. Watching him with his daughter, seeing the tender care he took despite his obvious exhaustion, made something warm unfurl in Sophia's chest. "You're a natural father," she said softly, meaning it completely. "Isabella is lucky to have someone who cares so much about her well-being." Something shifted in Dante's expression at her words. Vulnerability, replacing the careful control he'd been maintaining. "I never expected to be doing this alone," he admitted quietly, his voice carrying a weight of emotion that made her heart squeeze. "Francesca and I had planned everything together, prepared for parenthood as a team. When she died, I felt completely lost. I still feel lost most of the time." The honesty in his admission made Sophia want to reach out and comfort him, to offer some reassurance that he was doing better than he realized. But there was something in his posture that suggested he wasn't accustomed to accepting comfort, that vulnerability was dangerous territory for him. As the afternoon progressed, they fell into an easy routine that felt surprisingly natural. Sophia handled Isabella's feeding and playtime while Dante worked, but he emerged regularly to check on them, to offer help with anything she might need, to simply observe the way his daughter responded to her new caregiver's attention. When evening approached and Maria began preparing dinner in the kitchen, Dante suggested that Sophia stay for the meal so they could discuss the specific terms of their arrangement. The invitation felt loaded with possibility, an extension of their time together that had nothing to do with practical childcare discussions and everything to do with the connection that seemed to be building between them. "You don't have to cook for me," Sophia protested as Maria began pulling ingredients from the refrigerator. "I should probably head home soon anyway." "Nonsense," Maria said firmly, her tone brooking no argument. "Mr. Romano rarely eats proper meals when he's alone with Isabella. Tonight, we all eat together like a family." The word family hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that made Sophia's pulse quicken. She wasn't family, was barely even an employee yet, but something about the domestic scene felt comfortable in a way that should have been alarming. Isabella was content in her arms. Dante was more relaxed than she'd seen him since they met, and the elegant penthouse was beginning to feel less intimidating and more like a home. When Maria announced that dinner would be ready in an hour, Dante approached with an expression that suggested he was working up to something important. "There's something I should mention," he said, his voice careful in a way that immediately put Sophia on alert. "About the security requirements for this position." "Security requirements?" Sophia repeated, though she was beginning to suspect she already knew where this conversation was heading. "Isabella and I receive some protection, given the nature of my business," Dante explained, his words chosen with obvious care. "There are occasionally situations that require extra caution. Nothing dangerous," he added quickly, "but you should be aware that there are protocols to follow when you're caring for her." Before Sophia could ask for clarification about what kind of protocols might be necessary for caring for an infant, the sound of the elevator arriving in the foyer interrupted their conversation. Dante immediately moved toward the entrance, his posture shifting into something more alert and protective as he went to greet whoever was arriving. Sophia heard male voices speaking in Italian, the conversation brief and professional, before Dante returned with a younger man who looked like he spent significant time in a gym. The newcomer's suit was well-tailored, but couldn't completely disguise what Sophia was becoming increasingly certain was a shoulder holster beneath his jacket. "Sophia," Dante said, his voice carrying a formality that hadn't been there moments before, "I'd like you to meet Marco Torino. He handles security for our family." "Marco, this is Sophia Chun, Isabella's new caregiver." Marco's assessment of her was quick but thorough, the kind of evaluation that suggested he was measuring her against criteria that had nothing to do with childcare qualifications. When he extended his hand for a professional handshake, Sophia noticed the way his jacket shifted to reveal the unmistakable outline of a weapon. "Ms. Chun," Marco said, his voice respectful but carrying an undercurrent of warning. "Mr. Romano has explained that you'll be spending significant time with Isabella. I'll need to brief you on some basic safety protocols, just as a precaution." The reality of what she was walking into hit Sophia like a cold wave. This wasn't just about caring for a difficult baby or helping an overwhelmed single father. This was about entering a world where armed security was necessary, where safety protocols were required for infant care, where the luxury and elegance couldn't quite mask the underlying danger that seemed to permeate everything around Dante Romano. But as Isabella stirred in her arms and made those soft baby sounds that indicated she was waking from her nap, as Dante's green eyes met hers with an expression that was equal parts hope and desperation, Sophia realized that she'd already made her choice. She was walking into dangerous territory, but she was going to do it anyway, because this little girl needed her, and because something about the lonely, powerful man who was trying so hard to be a good father had already captured more of her heart than was probably wise. Whatever Dante Romano's world really involved, whatever complications came with his wealth and his need for armed security, Sofia was committed to seeing where this impossible situation would lead. She just hoped she was strong enough to handle whatever secrets were still waiting to be revealed. By Wednesday of her first week caring for Isabella, Sofia had settled into a routine that felt surprisingly natural despite the obvious luxury surrounding her daily life. She arrived at the penthouse each morning at 8, relieved Maria for the day's shift, and spent her time in the kind of domestic bliss that made her almost forget about the subtle undercurrents of danger that seemed to permeate Dante's world. Isabella was thriving under Sofia's consistent care. Her fussiness largely disappeared now that she had someone who could read her cues and respond appropriately. The baby's sleep had improved dramatically, which meant Dante was also getting more rest, and the positive changes in both father and daughter were obvious to everyone around them. Maria had taken to humming while she worked, clearly relieved that the household stress had decreased so significantly. But even as Sofia fell into the rhythm of caring for Isabella, feeding her bottles while overlooking Central Park and watching her discover new toys in the nursery that was better appointed than most people's entire homes, she couldn't shake her awareness that there were layers to Dante's life that she wasn't being allowed to see. He worked from his home office most days, handling phone calls in multiple languages and meeting with various associates who arrived and departed with the kind of professional efficiency that suggested they were accustomed to operating on his schedule. The men who visited were always impeccably dressed, always respectful to both Sofia and Maria, but there was something about them that set off her instincts, some quality that reminded her of Marco and his carefully concealed weapon. That Wednesday afternoon, while Isabella napped peacefully in her crib and Dante was handling what sounded like a particularly intense conference call from his office, Sofia realized they were running low on the special formula Isabella preferred. She'd checked the nursery supply cabinet, but the last canister was nearly empty, and Dante had mentioned that he kept backup supplies in his office desk. She approached his office quietly, not wanting to interrupt what was clearly an important business discussion. Through the partially open door, she could see him pacing behind his desk, speaking rapid Italian into his Bluetooth headset, while simultaneously reviewing documents spread across his workspace. His entire posture radiated authority and barely controlled tension, and when he switched to English to emphasize a particularly important point, his voice carried the kind of cold command that made her understand why his associates treated him with such deference. "This is not negotiable," he was saying, his tone suggesting that whoever was on the other end of the call would be wise not to test his patience. "The shipment goes out on schedule, exactly as planned, and anyone who has a problem with that arrangement can discuss it with me personally." The menace in those last words made Sofia hesitate at the threshold. This was not the voice of a man who handled legitimate import-export business. This was something darker, something that operated in worlds she didn't understand and probably didn't want to explore. But Isabella would need her bottle when she woke up, and Sofia had learned that the baby's schedule was not flexible without consequences for everyone in the household. Taking a deep breath, she knocked softly on the door frame and stepped into the office when Dante gestured for her to enter. The office was as elegantly appointed as the rest of the penthouse, with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and a massive desk that spoke of serious business conducted within these walls. But what caught Sofia's attention immediately were the monitors displaying what appeared to be security feeds from multiple locations, the kind of surveillance setup that suggested either paranoia or genuine necessity for constant vigilance. "I need to grab some formula for Isabella," she said quietly, indicating the desk where Dante had told her the supplies were stored. "She'll be waking up soon." Dante nodded and pointed toward the bottom drawer of his desk, but his attention remained focused on his call. Sofia approached the desk quietly, opening the indicated drawer to find the backup baby supplies neatly organized alongside various office materials. But as she reached for the formula canister, her hand brushed against something cold and metallic that definitely didn't belong in a drawer full of infant care products. Her blood ran cold as her fingers identified the unmistakable shape of a handgun. a serious-looking weapon that was clearly loaded and ready for use. This wasn't a collectible or a prop. This was the kind of firearm that suggested Dante expected to need deadly force at some point in his daily life. The discovery hit her like a physical blow, confirming every suspicion she'd been trying to rationalize away since she'd started working in this household. The expensive security, the deferential associates, the carefully chosen words about the nature of his business, all of it suddenly made terrifying sense. Dante Romano wasn't just wealthy. He was dangerous. Her sharp intake of breath must have been audible, because Dante immediately ended his call and turned toward her with an alertness that confirmed her worst fears. When he saw her expression and the way she was staring into his desk drawer, something shifted in his face, the charming mask dropping away to reveal the cold, calculating man she'd glimpsed in moments when he thought she wasn't watching. "Close the drawer, Sophia," he said quietly, his voice carrying a note of command that made it clear this wasn't a request. But instead of obeying, Sophia took a step backward, her mind racing with the implications of what she'd discovered. "What is this?" she demanded, her voice shakier than she would have liked. "What kind of import-export business requires you to keep loaded guns in your desk?" Dante moved around his desk with the fluid grace that had always struck her as vaguely predatory. But now she understood why her instincts had been warning her about him from the beginning. He wasn't just confident. He was dangerous in ways she'd been naive not to recognize. "Sit down," he said, indicating one of the leather chairs facing his desk. "We need to have a conversation that I'd hoped could wait a while longer." "I don't want to sit down," Sophia replied, backing toward the office door as fear overrode every other emotion flooding through her system. "I want you to tell me the truth about what you really do. About why you need weapons and security, and why men who look like bodyguards visit you every day." Dante studied her face for a long moment, and she could see him weighing his options, calculating how much truth he could afford to reveal and how much damage control might be necessary. When he spoke again, his voice carried the kind of careful honesty that suggested he'd decided she'd already seen too much to be satisfied with comfortable lies. "My family has been involved in certain aspects of business in this city for several generations," he said, his words chosen with obvious care. "We handle logistics and territorial arrangements for various enterprises that operate outside conventional corporate structures." The euphemistic language made Sophia's stomach turn. He was talking about organized crime, about the kind of criminal enterprise that required guns and armed security and the ability to eliminate threats permanently. And she'd been caring for his daughter, living in his penthouse, falling for his apparent vulnerability, without understanding that everything about him was far more dangerous than she'd imagined. "You're in the Mafia," she said bluntly, needing to hear him acknowledge the truth without the careful diplomatic language. "That's what you're telling me. You're a criminal." Something flashed in Dante's eyes at her direct challenge, but he didn't deny her assessment. "I'm a capo in the Romano family organization," he confirmed, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was admitting. "It's a position I inherited when my father died, not something I chose. But yes, my business involves activities that operate outside legal boundaries." The simple acknowledgement of his criminal involvement sent panic flooding through Sophia's nervous system. She'd been living in a fantasy, seduced by his apparent devotion to his daughter and his obvious grief over his wife's death. But now she understood that everything about their arrangement had been built on lies and careful omissions. "I have to go," she said, moving toward the door with increasing urgency. "I can't be here. I can't be part of this." But before she could reach the threshold, Dante's phone rang with the kind of urgent, insistent tone that suggested crisis. He glanced at the caller ID, and whatever he saw there made his entire expression change from concern about her reaction to something approaching panic. "I have to take this," he said, his voice carrying an edge of fear that was completely different from the controlled authority she'd witnessed during his earlier business calls. When he answered, he immediately switched to Italian. But even without understanding the language, Sophia could hear the tension and alarm in his rapid responses. As the conversation continued, Dante's face grew progressively paler, and when he finally ended the call, he looked at Sophia with an expression that was equal parts desperation and determination. "We have a problem," he said simply. "The Torino family has decided to send me a message about some recent territorial disputes. They've made threats against Isabella." The words hit Sophia like ice water. Whatever criminal activities Dante was involved in, his innocent Fourmont-Hold daughter was now being targeted because of them. The baby she'd been caring for, the little girl who'd captured her heart so completely, was in danger because her father had inherited a legacy of violence and retribution. What kind of threats? Sophia asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. The kind that require us to assume they're serious, Dante replied grimly. Marco is already mobilizing additional security, but until we can neutralize the situation, Isabella needs constant protection. As if summoned by the mention of danger to her charge, Sophia heard Isabella's soft wake-up sounds coming from the nursery. The baby would be hungry soon, would need her afternoon feeding and diaper change, would require the kind of normal, loving care that seemed impossible in the context of criminal threats and armed security. I should go to her, Sophia said, but Dante caught her arm gently as she moved past him. Sophia, wait, he said urgently. I know this is overwhelming, and I know you have every right to walk away from this situation. But Isabella needs you. She's finally stable, finally sleeping through the night and eating properly. And changing caregivers now would be traumatic for her even under normal circumstances. The appeal to her nursing instincts and her obvious affection for Isabella was calculated, Sophia realized. But it was also completely accurate. Disrupting the baby's routine now, when she'd finally found stability and comfort, would be cruel regardless of the circumstances surrounding her father's criminal activities. From the nursery, Isabella's sounds were becoming more insistent, the soft fussing that indicated she was fully awake and ready for attention. Sophia found herself torn between her survival instincts, which demanded that she remove herself from this dangerous situation immediately, and her protective instincts toward a baby who had no choice about the world she'd been born into. Before she could make a decision about how to respond to Dante's plea, Marco appeared in the office doorway with an expression that suggested the security situation had just become significantly more urgent. Mr. Romano, he said, his voice tight with controlled alarm. We need to move everyone to secure locations immediately. Intelligence suggests the Torino operation may already be in motion. The professional language of crisis management made the danger feel suddenly immediate and real. This wasn't theoretical anymore. This was the kind of situation where people got hurt, where innocent babies became casualties in conflicts they had no part in creating. But as Sophia looked toward the nursery where Isabella was calling for attention with increasing volume, she realized that walking away wasn't really an option anymore. Whatever dangerous territory she'd stumbled into, whatever criminal enterprise she'd accidentally become associated with, there was a little girl who needed protection and care, and Sophia couldn't abandon her to face whatever was coming alone. I'll stay, she heard herself saying, the words out of her mouth before her rational mind could stop them. But I want to know everything. No more lies, no more diplomatic language. If I'm going to protect Isabella, I need to understand exactly what we're up against. The relief that flooded Dante's expression was so profound it made her chest tight. For just a moment, the dangerous criminal mastermind disappeared completely, replaced by a desperate father who'd been terrified of losing the only person who could provide his daughter with the stability she desperately needed. Thank you, he said simply, but those two words carried the weight of absolute gratitude. I promise you, whatever else happens, I will keep both of you safe. That's not just my obligation as Isabella's father. That's my commitment to you. As they moved toward the nursery to collect Isabella and prepare for whatever security measures Marco deemed necessary, Sophia realized that she'd just crossed a line she could never uncross. She was no longer just a pediatric nurse helping with temporary childcare. She was part of Dante Romano's world now, with all the danger and complexity that entailed. 2 hours later, despite Marco's security concerns, Sophia found herself pushing Isabella's stroller through Central Park during what had become their established afternoon routine. Dante had argued against the outing, but Marco had pointed out that maintaining normal patterns might actually be safer than dramatically altering their behavior, which could signal that they were aware of the threat. Isabella was enjoying the crisp October air, her bright eyes tracking the falling leaves and the other children playing in the distance. This was typically her favorite time of day, when the late afternoon sun filtered through the trees and she could observe the world from her comfortable stroller. But today, Sophia found herself scanning their surroundings with a hypervigilance that had nothing to do with normal childcare caution. Marco and another man she didn't recognize were maintaining what he'd called discreet surveillance, positioned where they could intervene quickly if necessary, but far enough away to avoid drawing attention to their protective presence. The arrangement should have made her feel safer, but instead it reminded her with every step that they were moving through dangerous territory. They were approaching the playground near the reservoir when Sophia first noticed the two men who seemed to be paying too much attention to her and Isabella. They were positioned on opposite sides of the path, dressed casually, but with an alertness that reminded her uncomfortably of Marco's professional awareness. When she changed direction slightly to test her suspicions, both men adjusted their positions accordingly. Her pulse began racing as she realized that Marco's intelligence about the Torino family threats might have been more urgent than anyone had anticipated. These men weren't just watching. They were positioning themselves to act. Sophia reached for her phone to contact Marco, but before she could complete the call, one of the men began approaching with purposeful strides. His smile was friendly enough to fool casual observers, but his eyes were cold and calculating in a way that made every maternal instinct in her body scream with alarm. "Excuse me, miss," he said as he drew closer, his voice carrying an accent she couldn't place. "Beautiful baby you have there. Mind if I take a closer look?" Without waiting for her response, he moved toward the stroller with clear intent to reach for Isabella. Sophia immediately stepped between him and the baby, her heart hammering as she realized that this was exactly the kind of situation Marco had been preparing for. "Please stay back," she said firmly, hoping her voice carried more authority than she felt. "We're just trying to enjoy a peaceful walk." But the man continued approaching, and from her peripheral vision, Sophia could see his partner moving to flank them from the other direction. They were being surrounded, and Isabella was the obvious target. "Oh, I think you misunderstand," the first man said, his friendly facade dropping away to reveal something much more menacing. "We're not here for a social conversation. We're here to deliver a message to Mr. Romano, and his little girl is going to help us make sure he receives it clearly." The explicit threat against Isabella sent terror and fury flooding through Sophia's nervous system in equal measure. This innocent baby, who was making soft, happy sounds as she watched the leaves overhead, was being targeted by men who saw her as nothing more than leverage in whatever criminal conflict they had with her father. But before either man could make another move toward the stroller, Sophia heard rapid footsteps approaching from multiple directions. Marco appeared as if from nowhere, his weapon drawn but held low enough to avoid alarming other park visitors. The second security operative materialized on the other side of their attackers, effectively surrounding the men who'd been trying to surround Sophia and Isabella. "Gentlemen," Marco said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of deadly calm that suggested he was completely comfortable with the possibility of violence. "I think you're lost. This is not your territory, and that is not your business." The speed with which the situation shifted from threat to control was almost dizzying. The men who'd been confidently approaching Isabella's stroller suddenly found themselves outmaneuvered and outgunned, their confident aggression replaced by the careful neutrality of people who recognized they'd made a serious tactical error. "Tell your boss that Mr. Romano received his message," Marco continued, never raising his voice but somehow making every word carry the weight of absolute authority. "Tell him that any further communication should go through proper channels, not through innocent children." The confrontation ended as quickly as it had begun, with the would-be attackers retreating with the kind of speed that suggested they understood exactly how close they'd come to serious consequences. But as Marco and his partner escorted Sophia and Isabella back toward the penthouse, she realized that what had just happened was only the beginning of whatever conflict was brewing between Dante's organization and their rivals. Back in the safety of the penthouse, while Maria fussed over Isabella and Marco coordinated additional security measures, Dante found Sophia sitting in the living room staring out at the park where they'd just been threatened. She was trying to process what it meant to live in a world where armed men felt comfortable approaching babies in public spaces, where every routine activity carried the potential for violence. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly, settling beside her on the sofa with the careful movements of someone who wasn't sure if his presence would be welcome. "I don't know," Sophia replied honestly. I keep thinking about what could have happened if Marco hadn't been watching. If those men had actually managed to take Isabella, what would they have done to her? The anguish in her voice seemed to hit Dante like a physical blow. For several moments, he didn't respond, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight of pain that suggested he'd been thinking about exactly the same possibilities. "This is why I never wanted this life," he said quietly, his usual control replaced by raw vulnerability. "When my father died and I inherited his position in the family, I knew what it would mean. I knew the dangers, the obligations, the enemies that came with the territory. But Francesca was already pregnant with Isabella, and walking away would have created more problems than staying." The mention of his late wife brought a new dimension to Sophia's understanding of his situation. He'd inherited criminal responsibility when he was about to become a father, trapped by circumstances and family loyalty at the exact moment when he should have been focused on protecting his new family. "What happened to her?" Sophia asked gently. "To Francesca." Dante's expression grew distant, painful in a way that suggested the wound was still fresh despite the months that had passed. "She was killed in a car accident 6 weeks after Isabella was born," he said simply. "But it wasn't really an accident. It was another family sending me a message about territorial disputes, using my wife to demonstrate their reach." The stark revelation hit Sophia like ice water. Francesca hadn't died from delivery complications as Dante had originally implied. She'd been murdered, killed by people who wanted to hurt Dante, and saw his family as acceptable collateral damage. And now Isabella was facing the same kind of threats that had taken her mother's life. "I've been living with the knowledge that my enemies killed my wife to hurt me," Dante continued, his voice barely audible. "And now they're threatening my daughter for the same reason. The life I inherited has cost me everything that matters. But I can't walk away without making the situation worse for everyone in my organization who depends on my protection." The impossible complexity of his position was becoming clear to Sophia. He wasn't just a criminal who'd chosen a dangerous lifestyle. He was a man trapped by inherited obligations, trying to protect his daughter while honoring commitments that put them both in constant danger. "This is why Isabella needs you," he said, meeting her eyes with desperate honesty. "Not just because you're good with babies, but because you're not part of this world. You're clean, innocent, someone who can give her the kind of normal childhood love that I can't provide while managing the family business." As if summoned by her father's emotional vulnerability, Isabella began crying from her nursery, the sound cutting through the heavy atmosphere with urgent demand for attention. When Sophia automatically moved to respond to the baby's needs, Dante caught her hand gently. "Are you sure you want to stay?" he asked quietly. "After what happened today, after everything you now know about what being here really means, I won't blame you if you decide this is too much to handle." Sophia looked toward the nursery where Isabella was calling for comfort, then back at the man who'd just revealed the devastating truth about his wife's death and his own impossible circumstances. Every rational instinct she possessed was telling her to run, to remove herself from this dangerous situation before she became another casualty in conflicts she didn't understand. But when she thought about Isabella, about the little girl who'd finally found stability and comfort in her care, about the way the baby's face lit up every time she entered the room, Sophia realized that walking away wasn't really an option anymore. "I'm staying," she said firmly, meaning it despite the fear that was still coursing through her system. "Isabella needs me, and despite everything that's happened, I think you do too. We'll figure out how to keep her safe together." 2 weeks after the park confrontation, the penthouse had become a fortress disguised as a luxury home. Additional security personnel maintained discreet positions throughout the building. Surveillance had been upgraded to military-grade equipment, and every outing required careful coordination with Marco's team. But despite the obvious precautions, life had settled into a rhythm that felt surprisingly domestic and intimate. Sophia had moved beyond her initial fear of Dante's criminal world into something deeper and more complicated. She understood now that he hadn't chosen this life, that every decision he made was calculated to protect the people under his care, including his own daughter. The man who gave orders that could end lives was also the one who spent hours reading bedtime stories to Isabella, who knew exactly how she liked her bottles warmed and which lullabies would soothe her to sleep. Their days had fallen into a pattern of shared responsibility that felt increasingly natural. Sophia handled Isabella's care while Dante worked from his office, but he emerged regularly to help with feedings, to play with his daughter during her alert periods, to simply be present for the small moments that made up their daily life together. The boundaries between employer and employee had blurred into something that felt dangerously close to an actual family. It was during one of these quiet evening moments, after Isabella had been settled for the night and Maria had retired to her own quarters, that the careful control they'd both been maintaining finally cracked. Sophia was tidying up the living room while Dante reviewed security reports at the dining table. But when she bent to retrieve one of Isabella's toys from beneath the sofa, she found him watching her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "You don't have to do that," he said quietly, rising from his chair to approach where she was kneeling. "Maria can handle the cleaning tomorrow." "I don't mind," Sophia replied, but when she looked up at him, the words died in her throat. He was standing close enough that she could see the exhaustion in his eyes, the way the stress of constant vigilance was wearing on him despite his efforts to maintain his usual composure. When he reached down to help her to her feet, his hands lingered on hers longer than strictly necessary, and something electric passed between them that had nothing to do with their professional arrangement and everything to do with weeks of growing attraction and shared intimacy. "Sophia," he said softly, her name carrying a weight of longing that made her heart race. "I know this situation is complicated, and I know you have every reason to maintain professional boundaries. But I need you to know that what you've brought into our lives, the stability you've given Isabella, the peace you've given me, it's more than I ever hoped for." The vulnerability in his admission made something warm unfurl in her chest. This powerful, dangerous man was standing before her with his defenses completely down, admitting that he needed her in ways that went far beyond childcare. And if she was being honest with herself, she needed him too. Needed the way he made her feel protected and valued, and essential to something larger than herself. "Dante," she began, but before she could find words for the complexity of her feelings, he stepped closer, his hand coming up to cup her cheek with a gentleness that took her breath away. "Tell me to stop," he said quietly, his thumb stroking across her skin with tender precision. "Tell me this is just about Isabella and nothing more, and I'll step back and we'll pretend this moment never happened." But Sophia couldn't tell him to stop, couldn't pretend that she hadn't been falling for him a little more every day since she'd started caring for his daughter. Instead of answering with words, she rose on her toes and kissed him, pouring weeks of unspoken longing into the contact. The kiss started gentle, tentative, but quickly deepened as they stopped fighting the attraction that had been building between them since that first night at the wedding. Dante's arms came around her, pulling her closer as she melted into his warmth, into the sense of coming home that she felt whenever he held her. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Sophia could see her own desire reflected in his eyes. "This is dangerous territory," she whispered, though she made no move to step away from him. "Everything about my life is dangerous territory," Dante replied, his voice rough with want. "But this, what's happening between us, this is the first thing in years that's felt completely right." Their second kiss was hungrier, more urgent, and when Dante swept her up in his arms to carry her toward his bedroom, Sophia felt every rational objection dissolve in the face of need that had been building for weeks. This wasn't just physical attraction, though the chemistry between them was undeniable. This was about trust and vulnerability and the recognition that what they'd built together caring for Isabella had grown into something profound and precious. Their lovemaking was tender and emotional, focused on connection and the wonder of finally being able to express feelings they'd been carefully controlling. Dante was gentle with her, attentive to her responses in a way that suggested her pleasure was more important to him than his own. When they finally collapsed together, spent and satisfied, Sophia felt a completeness she hadn't realized she'd been missing. Afterward, as they lay entwined in his enormous bed with the city lights filtering through the windows, Dante traced patterns on her bare shoulder while they talked quietly about everything and nothing. This was the intimacy she'd been craving without realizing it, the domestic bliss that came from sharing not just physical pleasure, but emotional honesty. "I love you," he said suddenly, the words simple but carrying such weight that they made her heart stop for a moment. "I know it's too soon and too complicated, but I needed you to know. What we have, It's not just about Isabella anymore. It's about you and me and the family we could be together. The declaration should have terrified her, but instead it filled her with a warmth that felt like coming home. I love you too, she replied, meaning it completely. I love you and Isabella and this life we're building together, even if I don't completely understand all the complicated parts yet. 3 days later, Sophia's younger sister Lily arrived for what was supposed to be a brief visit to see where Sophia was working. At 22, Lily was finishing her senior year at NYU, all long dark hair and sharp intelligence, with the kind of protective instinct toward her older sister that had made them incredibly close despite their age gap. The moment Lily walked into the penthouse, her eyes went wide with amazement at the obvious luxury surrounding them. "This is where you work?" she asked, taking in the panoramic views and expensive furnishings with the kind of assessment that suggested she was calculating exactly how much wealth was on display. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" Sophia replied, leading her sister toward the nursery where Isabella was playing contentedly in her crib. "But wait until you meet Isabella. She's the real reason I'm here." Lily's expression softened immediately when she saw the baby, her natural maternal instincts engaging as Isabella reached up with grabbing hands and made happy gurgling sounds. "She's gorgeous," Lily said sincerely. "But Soph, this setup, the luxury, the obvious money, what exactly does this guy do that allows him to afford all this?" Before Sophia could formulate an answer that wouldn't alarm her sister, Dante appeared in the nursery doorway with the kind of timing that suggested he'd been monitoring their conversation. He was impeccably dressed as always, but when he smiled at Lily, Sophia could see him deliberately projecting charm rather than his usual authority. "You must be Lily," he said, extending his hand for a polite handshake. "I'm Dante Romano. Sophia has told me so much about you. Thank you for letting me steal your sister's time to help with Isabella." Lily's assessment of Dante was quick but thorough, and Sophia could see her sister taking in everything from his expensive suit to the way he moved with predatory grace. "Nice to meet you, Mr. Romano," Lily replied politely, but her tone carried a note of caution that suggested she was reserving judgment. Over lunch, while Maria served them elegant sandwiches and Isabella dozed in her carrier, Lily asked careful questions about Sophia's work arrangement. But every answer seemed to raise additional concerns, and when Dante excused himself to take a business call, Lily immediately leaned forward with obvious worry. "Soph, I'm concerned about this situation," she said quietly. "This level of wealth, the obvious security, the way he carries himself, something about this doesn't feel right. What exactly has he told you about his business?" The direct question forced Sophia to confront how much her life had changed in just a few weeks. A month ago, she would have shared Lily's concerns, would have recognized the warning signs that her sister was pointing out. But now, having lived in Dante's world and understood the complexity of his situation, the dangers felt manageable compared to the happiness she'd found. "It's complicated," Sophia said finally, "but I'm safe, and Isabella needs me. I've never felt more useful or more valued than I do here." But Lily's worried expression didn't ease, and when Dante returned from his call, Sophia could see her sister studying him with the kind of protective intensity that suggested she was preparing to have serious words with anyone who might hurt her older sister. That afternoon, Sophia accompanied Isabella to a routine pediatric appointment, one of the few outings that Marco had deemed safe enough to maintain during the heightened security period. The doctor's office was in a medical building that had been carefully screened, with additional security positioned throughout the facility. The appointment went smoothly, with Isabella charming the pediatrician and demonstrating all the healthy development milestones that confirmed she was thriving under Sophia's care. But as they prepared to leave the building, Sophia noticed that Marco seemed unusually tense, speaking rapidly into his earpiece while scanning the lobby with hypervigilance. "Is everything all right?" Sophia asked quietly, adjusting Isabella's carrier while trying not to attract attention from other patients and visitors. "Just a precaution," Marco replied, but his expression suggested the situation was more serious than he was indicating. "We're going to take a different route back to the penthouse, and I need you to stay close to me at all times." But as they approached the building's exit, Marco's earpiece crackled with urgent communication that made his entire posture shift into high alert. Without warning, he grabbed Sophia's arm, and began moving toward a side exit with the kind of speed that suggested immediate danger. The attack came from multiple directions simultaneously. Armed men appeared in the lobby as if from nowhere, moving with military precision to cut off all possible escape routes. Marco immediately drew his weapon while pushing Sophia behind a marble pillar, but before he could coordinate a defensive response, one of the attackers fired what appeared to be a tranquilizer dart that dropped him unconscious within seconds. Sophia found herself surrounded by professionals who moved with terrifying efficiency, separating her from Isabella's carrier with surgical precision. The baby began crying as strangers handled her, but her distress was quickly muffled as the kidnappers secured both their prizes and retreated through predetermined escape routes. The entire operation took less than 3 minutes, leaving the medical building in chaos as civilians scrambled for safety and security. Alarms wailed uselessly. By the time additional Romano family operatives arrived to investigate the breach, both Sophia and Isabella had vanished completely. When Dante received the call about the kidnapping, his reaction was immediate and terrifying in its cold fury. Every resource at his disposal was mobilized within minutes, transforming the penthouse into a command center focused entirely on locating and recovering his daughter and the woman he loved. Find them, he ordered Marco, who was nursing a concussion but insisting on remaining operational despite medical advice. Use every contact, call in every favor, activate every surveillance network we have access to. I want them found within the hour. The controlled violence in Dante's voice made it clear that whoever had taken Isabella and Sophia had just made the last mistake of their lives. This wasn't just business anymore. This was personal, and Dante Romano's idea of personal justice was absolute and final. 6 hours later, when Dante and his team finally traced the kidnappers to a warehouse in Queens, his assault was swift and decisive. The Torino family operatives who had thought they could use his daughter as leverage discovered that they had seriously underestimated both his reach and his capacity for retribution. Sophia found herself huddled in a storage room with Isabella, trying to keep the traumatized baby calm while listening to sounds of violence from the main warehouse floor. When the door finally opened to reveal Dante's familiar silhouette, both she and Isabella immediately reached for him with desperate relief. The reunion was emotional beyond anything Sophia had experienced. Dante gathered both of them in his arms as though he'd thought he might never see them again. And when Isabella immediately calmed at her father's touch, Sophia realized that they'd survived something that could have destroyed all of them. Later, safe in the penthouse while additional security ensured they wouldn't face further threats, Dante's careful control finally cracked completely. He sat in the nursery, holding Isabella while she slept, but his hands were shaking with the aftermath of fear and fury. I almost lost you both, he said quietly, his voice raw with emotion. If something had happened to you because of my enemies, because of the life I inherited, I would never have forgiven myself. But we're safe, Sophia replied, settling beside him to rest her head against his shoulder. You found us, you protected us, and we're home now. The word home seemed to break something in Dante's chest. Home, he repeated softly. Yes, this is home, and you and Isabella are my family. Nothing else matters except keeping you both safe and happy for the rest of our lives. 1 month after the warehouse confrontation that had ended the Torino family's threat permanently, the penthouse felt like a completely different world. Gone was the fortress-like tension that had characterized their daily life for weeks. In its place was a domestic tranquility that spoke of safety earned through decisive action and love discovered through shared crisis. Sophia had officially moved into the penthouse the week before, her few belongings from the Queen's studio apartment absorbed seamlessly into the elegant space that had become home. But the most significant change wasn't in the furniture or logistics. It was in the way Isabella had begun calling her mama, the word emerging naturally during their morning routine, as though the baby had simply decided that Sophia's place in their family was permanent and essential. The first time it happened, Sophia had been preparing Isabella's breakfast bottle when the 8-month-old looked up at her from her high chair and said clearly, "Mama, up," reaching her little arms toward the woman who had become the center of her world. The moment had stopped Sophia's heart completely, filling her with a joy so profound it brought tears to her eyes. Dante had witnessed the exchange from the kitchen doorway, and when Sophia looked up to find him watching with an expression of wonder and gratitude, she knew that something fundamental had shifted for all of them. They weren't just playing house anymore. They were a family in every sense that mattered, bound together by love and choice and the shared experience of protecting what was precious. That afternoon, Dante had arranged for Sophia to meet his mother and extended family at the Romano matriarch's elegant Brooklyn Heights brownstone. The gathering was presented as a casual family dinner, but Sophia understood it was actually a formal introduction to the people whose approval would determine her place in Dante's complicated world. Teresa Romano was a formidable woman in her early 70s, with steel-gray hair styled impeccably and the kind of sharp intelligence that suggested she missed nothing important. When Sophia entered the brownstone carrying Isabella, who immediately charmed everyone with her bright smiles and happy babbling, Teresa's assessment was thorough but surprisingly warm. "So you are the woman who has given my son peace," Teresa said, her accented English formal but kind. "Isabella, she looks healthy and happy. This is not easy to achieve when a baby loses her mother so young." The simple acknowledgement of the tragedy that had shaped their family, combined with recognition of Sophia's role in healing the wounds it had left, felt like acceptance on a level she hadn't dared hope for. Over dinner, while Isabella entertained her new extended family with her developing personality, Sophia found herself welcomed into conversations about family history, business matters that were discussed in careful euphemisms, and plans for upcoming celebrations that would now include her. Dante's cousin Marco, not to be confused with their security chief, was particularly warm in his welcome. "You have made Dante smile again," he told Sophia quietly during dessert. "For months after Francesca died, we worried he would never recover his joy in life. But watching him with you and Isabella tonight, he is himself again." The evening concluded with Isabella falling asleep in her grandmother's arms, while Teresa shared stories about Dante's childhood, painting a picture of a boy who had been gentle and studious before inheriting responsibilities that required him to become hard and calculating. But here, surrounded by family, Sophia could see glimpses of that gentle boy in the way Dante interacted with his relatives, the way his entire demeanor softened when he was with people he trusted completely. 2 weeks later, on a quiet Tuesday evening after Isabella had been settled for the night and Maria had retired to her quarters, Dante surprised Sophia by setting up an intimate dinner in the penthouse's formal dining room. Candles flickered on the polished table while soft music played in the background, creating an atmosphere of romance that made her pulse quicken with anticipation. "This is beautiful," she said, accepting the glass of wine he offered while admiring the way the candlelight reflected off the crystal and china. "But what's the occasion? Do I need an occasion to celebrate the woman I love?" Dante replied, his smile carrying a warmth that made her heart flutter. "Though if you insist on reasons, I could mention that it's been exactly 2 months since you saved Isabella from a crying fit at a wedding and accidentally saved my life in the process." The reference to their meeting brought back memories of that elegant reception at the plaza, when she'd been a simple maid of honor helping a desperate father with his fussy infant. It felt like a lifetime ago, like she'd been a completely different person before she'd entered Dante's complicated world and found her place in it. Over dinner, they talked about everything from Isabella's development to plans for expanding the security business into legitimate enterprises to Sophia's thoughts about potentially returning to nursing part-time once Isabella was older. The conversation flowed easily, covering practical concerns and shared dreams with the comfort of two people who'd learned to trust each other completely. But when dessert arrived and Dante seemed unusually nervous, checking his watch repeatedly and glancing toward the living room where Isabella's baby monitor was positioned, Sophia began to suspect that this dinner had a purpose beyond simple celebration. "Sophia," he began, his voice carrying a formality that immediately captured her complete attention. "These past few months have taught me something I never expected to learn. When Francesca died, I thought my chance at happiness, at having a real family, died with her. I focused entirely on providing for Isabella and managing family obligations, but I never imagined I could love someone again the way I loved her." The mention of his late wife in this context made Sophia's heart begin racing, because she understood that for Dante, Comparing any relationship to what he'd shared with Francesca was the highest honor he could offer. But what I feel for you, he continued, reaching across the table to take her hand, is different and equally profound. You didn't just accept Isabella and me as we were. You healed us, helped us become better than we could have been alone. You made us a family when I thought that was impossible. As he spoke, Dante rose from his chair and moved around the table to where Sophia was sitting, her heart hammering as she realized what was happening. When he dropped to one knee beside her chair and produced a small velvet box from his jacket pocket, she felt tears spring to her eyes. Sophia-chan, will you marry me? He asked, his voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. Will you be Isabella's mother officially, legally, permanently? Will you be my partner in everything, the heart of our family, the woman I get to love for the rest of my life? Inside the box was the most beautiful ring she'd ever seen, an elegant solitaire that caught the candlelight and threw it back in brilliant sparks. But more important than any diamond was the man kneeling before her, offering her a future that 2 months ago she couldn't have imagined and now couldn't live without. Yes, she whispered, then said it louder. Yes, absolutely yes, as he slipped the ring onto her finger and rose to sweep her into his arms. The kiss they shared tasted like promises and forever, like the kind of love that could overcome any obstacle and create happiness from the most unlikely circumstances. From the baby monitor, Isabella's soft sleep sounds provided a peaceful soundtrack to the most important moment of Sophia's life, reminding them both that this wasn't just about the two of them anymore. This was about the family they'd created together, the future they would build, the love that would protect and sustain them through whatever challenges lay ahead. I want a simple ceremony, Sophia said later, as they sat together on the sofa planning their future while the ring sparkled on her finger. Nothing elaborate or ostentatious. Just family and friends celebrating what we've found together. Simple is fine, Dante agreed, though his smile suggested he was already planning ways to make their simple ceremony absolutely perfect. But I also want to celebrate you properly, to make sure everyone understands how lucky I am that you chose to love us both. 6 months later, on a perfect spring morning in Central Park, Sophia stood in an elegant pavilion surrounded by white flowers and the people who mattered most to them, preparing to marry the man who had transformed her life in ways she never could have predicted. Isabella, now walking confidently and chattering constantly, served as their flower girl, toddling down the aisle in a tiny white dress while scattering rose petals with more enthusiasm than precision. The ceremony was indeed simple, focused on the vows they wrote themselves rather than elaborate productions. But when Dante promised to love and protect both his girls for the rest of his life, when Sophia pledged to build their family on foundations of trust and unconditional care, there wasn't a dry eye among their guests. Teresa Romano wept openly as she watched her son marry the woman who had brought joy back into his life. Maria dabbed at her eyes while photographing every moment. Even Marco, their security chief, had to clear his throat repeatedly during the exchange of rings. The reception was held in the penthouse, transformed with flowers and lights into a space that felt magical but intimate. Isabella charmed everyone by dancing in her father's arms, her little hands clapping to the music while she babbled happily about everything she could see from her elevated perspective. Now here's something I want to ask all of you watching this. How many of you believe in second chances at love, in the possibility that sometimes the most impossible situations can lead to the most incredible families? Because sometimes life surprises us in the most amazing ways, bringing together people who were meant to find each other even when the circumstances seem completely wrong. Today I want to hear from you about those unexpected moments when everything changed for the better, when love showed up in ways you never saw coming. 2 years after their wedding, Sophia stood in the nursery they'd created for their son, watching Dante read bedtime stories to both Isabella and baby Michael while her hand rested protectively over her growing belly where their third child was developing. The domestic scene was so different from that chaotic wedding reception where they'd first met that sometimes she felt like she was living someone else's dream life. Isabella, now a confident 3-year-old, was explaining to her baby brother why the story Daddy was reading was particularly exciting, her commentary delivered with the kind of serious authority that suggested she'd inherited her father's natural leadership abilities. Michael, 8 months old and absolutely devoted to his big sister, listened with rapt attention to everything she said. "You're going to spoil them completely," Sophia told Dante affectionately as he settled both children with kisses and promises of more stories tomorrow. "They deserve to be spoiled," he replied, rising to gather her in his arms while being careful of her expanding middle. "All of you deserve everything good I can possibly provide. This family, this happiness, it's more than I ever thought possible." As they stood together in the doorway of their children's room, watching Isabella curl up with her favorite stuffed animal, while Michael settled into the peaceful sleep that came from being completely loved and secure, Sophia reflected on how dramatically her life had changed since that evening at the plaza. She'd been a single pediatric nurse helping her sister through college, focused on building financial security and professional satisfaction, but never imagining she could have the kind of love and family she'd witnessed in others. Now she was Mrs. Dante Romano, mother to children who filled her heart to bursting, partner to a man who treated her like she was the most precious thing in his world. The threats that had once seemed so terrifying were distant memories now. Dante's businesses had evolved into increasingly legitimate enterprises, though he retained enough of his dangerous reputation to ensure their families' continued safety. The Romano organization commanded respect through success rather than fear, and their children would grow up knowing their father was powerful but not needing to worry about the kinds of violence that had characterized earlier generations. "Do you ever think about that night we met?" Sophia asked as they settled into their own bed, the master suite quiet except for the soft sounds of their children sleeping peacefully down the hall. "Every day," Dante replied, pulling her close despite the logistics of accommodating her pregnant belly. "I think about how desperate I was, how lost I felt trying to manage everything alone. And then this angel appeared and saved my daughter from a crying fit, and somehow she decided to save me too." The contentment in his voice matched what Sophia felt in her own heart. They'd found each other in the most unlikely circumstances, built love from what should have been a simple professional arrangement, and created a family that was stronger and happier than either of them had dared dream possible. As sleep began to claim them both, Sophia listened to the sounds of their household settling for the night. Maria was probably reviewing tomorrow's schedule. The security team was maintaining their discreet watch, and their children were dreaming the peaceful dreams of young ones who knew they were completely safe and loved. This was the life she'd stumbled into by accepting an impossible job offer from a mysterious stranger at a wedding. This was what happened when kindness led to courage, when love grew from the most unlikely soil. This was proof that sometimes the most beautiful families were created not by tradition or expectation, but by people choosing each other again and again, day after day, building happiness from determination and devotion. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new joys, new moments of ordinary magic that made up the texture of their shared life. But tonight, surrounded by the love they'd created together, Sophia drifted off to sleep knowing that the impossible had become inevitable, that the family she'd never thought to want had become everything she needed.